Good evening, everybody, joining us for our latest ethics debate organised by ICOM France and the French Heritage Institute. I am delighted to be welcoming you here today. Unfortunately, not in person as we had hoped. We were obliged to switch to an online meeting due to difficulties traveling this evening, as you can imagine. But next time we will be delighted to organize an in-person meeting. I will start this evening by handing over straight to Charles Personnaz, whom I thank for joining us today. He is director of the French National Heritage Institute. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to see that, as always, there are so many people connecting in to our meeting this evening. Thank you very much to ICOM France for this partnership. We are really happy at the French National Heritage Institute to work on conceiving and organizing these excellent evenings. Event after event, we have the opportunity to explore a number of different contemporary issues facing museums. Today, this question of participation, perhaps not as you understood it by Charles de Gaulle, but participation of communities in museums, is what we will be discussing today. This topic is important because a number of museum professionals are facing this. I encountered this topic myself when considering issues surrounding history museums, how we can work with certain witnesses, certain communities, and how we can place that within an ethics context, within a scientific context. And these were the questions that we had to ask ourselves in order to take into account all of the different movements, the changes happening, and to make sure that everybody takes their rightful place. This is what we're going to be talking about today. It's been increasingly resonant in our society at the moment. And I'm sure this is also true for museum institutions that are sometimes questioned, and sometimes museums in any case should not be ivory towers up on a hill. They can also sometimes, however, be refuges away from the noise of the world, a place of contemplation and reflection. This is what we are reminded of at the moment through the noise and challenges facing our society at the moment. As a director of the National Heritage Institute, allow me to give a little bit of an announcement about this book, about heritage. It shows the different forms of requests for participation and ways of responding to that. We often think about more activist type participation, but professionals at heritage institutions are able to work with a number of different segments of society. It's not always been easy. We know that some museum directors face a lot of challenges. Charles, I do not know if we can hear you, but your connection appears to have cut out. We'd lost you for a moment. If you can hear me again now, I was just saying that this question does not date from, is not anything new. This is something that has been ongoing for a number of years, and we needed to find ways of working together in order to enrich museum institutions through participation. This is what we will be discussing this evening with our speakers, and I would like to thank the speakers, the audience, and ICOM France for this excellent partnership. Have an excellent evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Charles, for this introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Emma Nardi, President of ICOM International, and it's brilliant that she is here with us today. I would like to start with a quotation. The most important thing in the Olympic Games is not to win, but to participate, because the fight is the most important thing. There was a real temptation given the Olympic Games soon to have a title based on sport for our evening. Our maxim for this evening is going to be about inclusive initiatives, contributive projects, co-construction of exhibitions, participatory collections, and many, many more. In her introduction to this evening, Emilie will remind us of this context and related theories in the face of a civil society that's increasingly eager to be heard and to participate in the life of our institutions. Museums of society, history, fine arts, science, all museum families are affected and are developing shared projects which are open to the contribution of other voices than those emanating from the museum itself, as Charles reminded us. The projects can be very activist and committed. In a recurring manner, they raise questions as they progress, push us to question our professional habits, to shake up our ways of working, and finally to question our fundamentals, to remain in the lexical field of sport, this time borrowing from rugby vocabulary. In a world that has become polyphonic or multivocal, where the levels and types of expertise are multiplying, how can we redefine and make the museum's voice heard? As the guarantor of a scientific and institutional discourse, this is an important question that we'll be looking at this evening. While museums can no longer afford to work in isolation from the society that surrounds them and of which they are a reflection, the integration of these external words must today be able to contribute to the credibility of museums, or to use the words of Alberto Galandini, former president of ICOM, who, when invited to Rome to the meeting of ministers of culture in preparation for the G20, stated that museums were the most credible institutions. Having personally led or monitored participatory projects in my professional capacity, I know that the difficulties encountered in conducting this type of project are numerous. What place should be given to the expression of other voices within the museum? How to ensure a real role of moderator? How can museum professionals be trained in these specific and sometimes difficult exercises? Should people from outside the museum who are involved in its activities be paid, and how? What is the right place for these practices, and how can they be supervised without being censored? What means should be used to evaluate them? These are just a few of many questions that we have today. I have no doubt that our speakers this evening will have some answers, and no doubt other questions. And all of this will contribute to reaffirming, but perhaps also redefining in a more demanding, more engaging, more combative context, perhaps, our responsibilities as museum professionals. I would like to thank all of you for being here today. There are over 160 of us here so far. This shows the interest in these matters. I would like to thank in advance all of the speakers tonight for having accepted to share their experience with generosity and honesty. I would also like to thank Marie-Laure Estignard, who is just opposite me. You can't see her. She'll be moderating this evening, along with all members of the ICOM board who have worked hard to prepare this evening. I would also like to thank the INP and its teams who make these meetings possible. Charles Personnaz, the director who we just listened to, Séverine Blenner-Michel, who is director of studies in the curational department, who will conclude our meeting, Emilie Maume, who is responsible for programming and scientific publications, and also the team of Jacqueline Lichtenstein, who unfortunately is not here with us today, but we thank them. Thank you to Anne-Claude Maurice, our permanent delegate, Alexia Makine, who works beneath Anne-Claude and has recently joined our team, sorry. And I would also like to thank our translation translators, as this will be translated into English and Spanish, and also to our stenographers for their very efficient work. This allows us to publish our events very quickly. Our meeting in December will be available within the next few weeks. Thank you very much, Antoine de Philippis, who I forgot to mention. He is working with Anne-Claude on behalf of ICOM France to help us with the technical aspects. I wish all of you an excellent and profitable evening, and especially to Emma Nardi. As I said, she honors us with her presence. She is president of ICOM International. Good evening, Emma. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm delighted to be representing ICOM to you, and I would like to share how grateful I am for you giving me this opportunity. As you said, the important thing is to participate. I thought as well straight away of the Olympic Games, and I'm sharing this because it is a message of peace, tolerance, and solidarity. I believe that museums have this major role of opening up to the public to give them bigger and bigger opportunities. I know the tradition of your debate evenings, and I've often taken part. I love how you tend to ask questions in order to frame these problems. These questions are logical proposals. They can lead to a variety of answers. They give space for opinion sharing and creating a collective line of thought. And it is the answers to these questions that characterize your national committee and more broadly, the world of museum professionals as a whole. The ICOM Executive Council, which concluded its mandate in Prague in 2022, produced two very important documents. These were enthusiastically approved by the General Assembly. The first is the new definition of museum, and secondly, the strategic plan. Your questions that you are asking this evening are very present in these documents. Openness to the public has always been one of the characteristics of museums. It's perhaps something that distinguishes them from private collections. In asking about the place for the expression of other voices within the museum, you touch on one of the fundamental characteristics of the new definition, which considers the museum as an institution that encourages diversity and sustainability, which does not only operates with the collaboration of diverse communities, but is also open to sharing knowledge. Emma, sorry, I think that your microphone has been switched off. We can no longer hear you. Can you hear me now? Yes, we can now. I don't know why it was switched off. I don't know where I was at. Perhaps I can talk about the tasks, changing the relationship between those who work in the museum and those who visit it. This creates a situation where knowledge is somehow shared, but even exchanged. This is easy to say, but very difficult to do. I have questions as well. How can we harmonize these different other voices as you define them? How can we encourage diversity, which is one of the points in our common strategic plan? How can we achieve a balance between what is inside and what is outside? The experience of the museum and the experience of the visitor. How can we avoid censorship without falling into demagogic confusion? This is very important. We do need to consider museum professionals as having this responsibility. How can we help mediators to integrate their traditional role with the new and much more nuanced role that is being asked of them today? These are questions that I am sure will be given necessary attention during your debate this evening. At the moment, the ICOM Executive Council is considering the implementation of the strategic plan. We are currently working on the potential strategy and on proposals that could be shared by all committees, and in particular, the national committees. I would like to anticipate one proposal. This year, the International Day of Museums is dedicated to the theme Museum Sustainability Wellbeing, which is one of the most important points in the ICOM strategic plan. I would like to launch a prize so that every committee can award a national prize following a protocol that we will discuss together and establish with the Museum and Society Department of the ICOM Secretariat and the Working Group for Sustainability. The award will be announced on the 18th of May. The protocols to participate will be ready a few months later with your collaboration. In 2024, we should be able to announce the winners for all of the committees that would like to join this initiative. An international jury will then select from these winners a global winner to be announced during the 2025 General Assembly in Dubai. I really believe in this initiative, as it is an opportunity to bring together all of the ICOM committees around a topic that is increasingly central to our discussions. I hope that I will be able to work with you on this discussion and others. Thank you very much for the translation in the 3 ICOM languages. All ICOM members, whether they speak English, French, or Spanish, will be able to actively participate in your work as usual. And I would like to underline this. I look forward to the publication of your debate. In the meantime, I wish you all excellent discussions and a lovely evening. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Emma, for your introduction, and thank you so much for being here this evening. This is so important to us. I'm going to hand over now to Marie-Laure Estignard, but in the meantime, please do share any questions you have in the chat, and we will be able to share those with the speakers. So please do write anything you like in the discussion in the chat box. I'm going to hand straight over to Marie-Laure Estignard now. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. We will be hearing from 6 speakers this evening. After each presentation, we will stop to talk about the different things shared. So the first 3 people to speak will be Emilie Sitzia, who holds a chair at the University of Amsterdam. Then we will have Xavier de la Selle and Lina Tahan. We will then have Annabelle Ténèze, Laurella Rinçon, and Luisa de Peña. Before wrapping up with a discussion around topics that impact all of us, I've worked in museums of society, for example, and I've done a lot of collections and participatory actions. Now in a museum of science, it is much more limited, this participatory aspect. So science museums, technical museums, we need to bring participation back in. Scientists are not the only ones who can contribute, but we have not won the battle yet. We need participatory scientific museums. We will be starting with Emilie Sitzia. Good evening, Emilie. She holds a chair at the University of Amsterdam and is an associate professor in cultural education at the University of Maastricht. She specializes in the impact of art on audiences, museology, and interdisciplinary studies around words, images, etc. In 2019, she was co-editor of the Stradley Studies issue entitled Towards a Museum of Mutuality. In 2020, she was a resident at the IMERA Institute for Advanced Studies in Marseille to work with the MUSEM, who we welcome Emilie from, on questions of identity, narrative, and strategies of multimodal exhibitions, which really feeds into what we're talking about today. She asks questions about engagement and how museums can engage with social issues and how to consider this issue of civil society. This is not easy. The question is how museums beyond this social issue can remain neutral. And finally, how, as museums, can we not be pushed around by the demands of society or militants, as we can see at the moment? Emilie will use a number of international examples to share her experience. Emilie, over to you now. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this invitation. I would like to start by apologizing for the many Anglicisms that I will be using in my presentation. English is my general working language. My experience is as a university lecturer for museums, working in the Netherlands as well. This evening, I would like to spend a bit of time talking about the change of context that we have seen in recent years. Firstly, we should mention the changing roles of museums in theory developed by sociology, museology, and the whole study apparatus around the issue of museums. The new museology, for example, has in recent years proposed a museological approach more centered on the public with collaboration at all different levels. And I'm sure that Xavier de la Selle will speak further about this as he will be talking about ecomuseums. Another change in context has been more publications on participatory practices. These are not always especially critical. They perceive participatory practices as the one and only solution to all problems encountered by museums, including problems of relevance, representation, and community, which are very prevalent in the English-speaking world in any case. We've also seen the urgent nature of the democratization of museums. In the world of the theory of museums, we've had increased discussion on issues about the emancipation and the empowerment of various communities and the development of the museum as an agonist museum where multiple voices come together. This is very interesting, but far from current museum practices. As well as this change of theoretical context, we need to take into account social change and ideological change. In the society in general and in museums particularly, there have been a number of game-changing changes. We now look at post-colonial and feminist approaches to inform museums. This has an impact on archives, storytellings. We're taking into account varied voices within a society which is, however, increasingly polarized from a social and political point of view. So we're looking simultaneously at very global and very local voices and movements. All these changes are visible in the new definition of museum, which you just talked about. Let me quote, it is a not-for-profit permanent institution and plays its role with the participation of communities. This is quite a precarious balance that museums find themselves in. We can see people working in museums saying that museums need to take a position and take sides. But then on the other hand, you have people such as Ténèze saying that we should not become a sounding board for identity claims of various groups. So the museum has to juggle between these different roles. Here you can see the Dutch carriage, the Dutch royal carriage. Perhaps you are wondering why I'm showing this. I believe that this is an example that has successfully reconciled these issues surrounding balance. This is an exhibition held from June 2021 to mid 2022 in Amsterdam, which exhibited the golden coach of the Dutch king. This is part of the royal collection given to the Queen in 1988 and is used by the royal family every year for celebrations with the prince, weddings, etc. This is a very contested piece of heritage due to the representation of colonies on the panels. The scientific director of the Amsterdam Museum has worked a lot on this project. He wanted to try to put into practice this idea of the Abonist polyvocal museum. And this shows the different strategies used. Firstly was to present multiple perspectives around the coach, which is in the middle. There are 6 rooms, some historical, some modern, that give multiple perspectives on the object. The Museum of Amsterdam also asked 18 contemporary artists to create artworks in response of this symbol, this material piece, and also, and particularly, the representation of colonies. With the public, there was a dialogue strategy implemented with a series of different slides. I'm not going to be able to go into much detail here, a series of different mechanisms, but this sought to present different perspectives around this coach and to hear and show the voices of the public around this work. This work had various levels. There are a number of different participatory approaches. I would like to focus more particularly now on what we mean by participation, because unfortunately, participation has not been well defined. Anna Alfers, a colleague of mine, and myself realized that this depends on the department and the culture within each department as to what participation means. There was often a lack of understanding between different members of the same body, if you like. By participation, we can mean plenty of things. We can mean attendance, who is coming to the museum. We can mean contribution, consultation, collaboration, co-creation of meaning and interpretation, co-creation of objects, artworks, event, and co-curation. I've seen one of my colleagues is here who will be able to share her personal experience about co-curation. This is all considered participation, but it's not all necessarily explicitly stated or discussed at the start of each project. And the differences between the different types of participation depends on the agency given to the public. This is the interaction between intention, action, and outcome. When we talk about participation, we're often talking about very different agency for the public and participants. If we're talking about attendance or if we're talking about co-creation, for instance.
I think there is an institutional necessity as well. And it's very important to give a part of the power as for individual emancipation and for the community and the reality of museum functions. Can we? Should we? Do we want to do this? And this is something that I have thought about and worked out with Julia. So I know that there are a lot of questions. Really, a lot of questions remain, more questions than answers, actually. And we're having a lot of discussions on this work. And these are the most important questions. What's happening beyond the exhibit? A lot of the participatory involvement, what are we doing that's sustainable? What remains? What is permanent? What can create a link with the community? How to negotiate the time of actual production. Sometimes it's very long in practice, and a lot of effort on the part of the participants as well. What strategies to build trust and amongst certain groups that they perceive, who perceive themselves as being fragile and vulnerable. What about the signatures and authorizations? How to go about the appraisals and what to do with academic knowledge, and then of course how do we work with catalogs and work that into the museum? How do we work on representation and receiving as well? I'm working on something that's called Never Enough and Never Perfect. And I think that's an impression that a lot of museums have that do participatory work. I think the question of museum professionals have new roles, and they're asking for this participatory involvement. What training is available? What new types of trainings are available, and how to work in harmony with the various departments and involve the participants? And of course, then there are some there's competition sometimes amongst, and how to avoid that. Sometimes it's institution, national. These are all very important things, but I think the most important thing is to avoid conflict, but how to make this conflict productive. And that's one of the keys of the work around participation and participatory work. But the most important thing is to participate. So thank you. I really think it's something that will not go away. And we really have to raise these questions and work on them. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Emilie. This enables us to have a point of view on this and to see what participatory work is in museums today. You spoke as an echo chamber and identity terms as well, and working in group and collegial work throughout the territory. I wanted to ask a question regarding the role of the decision makers. How do they and our authorities, how to handle their views, for example, the director of an institution, etc., or in this participatory work? Do we have to be careful that their views and propose don't serve their own political needs? And so how do you see their role of the politicians and decision makers? Well, I think that it's really something that must be extremely clear and be communicated very early on with the decision makers. and looking at what type of participation will be taking place. It's long-term work, and I think that it's very important to understand that it's not just the curator or an individual that does the participatory work. It's a whole ensemble of people. It's the entire institution. And if they don't all follow, then it's difficult to move forward. And what's important in this participatory discourse is the work with the decision makers. Yes. But is there no danger of going towards a conflict and seeing the decision makers and the community views being in conflict or contradictory? Well, these are just examples here. Well, yes, I've actually encountered that quite a few times. And it happens often when there are decisions that are quite violent and that have been taken. And they are, in my opinion, they don't really have their place in this type of practice. And it should be discussed well upstream. And otherwise, we shouldn't, come to hands with this. And we must be able to take it up in a non-violent manner and be able to negotiate if we want to work in a participatory manner. So on a chat, there's the question, since the decision makers are the donors and the financiers, sometimes we often said, well, we should just continue then if there's something else to add. Well, yes, I think the curator sometimes lets the others say things instead. Well, okay, for science, etc. So thank you very much, Emilie. And now we will go on to the with the Lyon Museum. There's a lot to be said there. Is in charge of history, and this integrates the graphic arts community. And Henri Malin, I think we worked a lot together. He works in the archives and a former student, and he worked in Champagne and also in the county archives of L'Aube, and collaborated quite often on various sectors of heritage, and led to the responsibility of the raised, and wrote memoirs on society, and in 2008, and was elected in 2022 president of the Federation of Ecomuseums and Museums of Society. And so he's going to give us a little bit of background and how he usually is in advance, well beyond the others. It's very innovative what they do. And at the Technical and Scientific Museum. And so you now have the floor. Thank you, Marie-Laure. Can you hear me well? Yes, okay, so my mic is working all right. Yes, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emilie and Marie-Laure. Thank you for inviting me here this evening. I work in a museum, and it's at the Federation of the Ecomuseum. And if I work in a museum today, it's due to the question of participation, actually, and I tried to bring up the manner in which the museums handle these eco museums and society, and this federation of the eco museums and museums of society. And so, but general and historic, maybe I'll just look at a few markers along the way. And I will show you a little presentation here. Maybe you can go to the next slide for the few elements that I'll be talking about. But maybe I'll cut it short, or I'll be shunting a few of the topics so that I don't keep the mic too long. Maybe a bit of background, because the managers of eco museums and society museums are part of a branch, Guarie and Jean Bernier, and there's this utopia. And usually this affiliation comes up, and I know this because I did work in 2018. I published what you see on the screen, and this got the scientific and museum worlds together, and this really was a good opportunity to bring together or just to gather all of the the feedback that we got, and set it up on indexes and for this feedback. So that was a very good thing to do, was to gather it all together. What's of interest here is to bring together, or to compare what happened, for example, in the 70s. This concept was born, that became the ecomuseum, and the general conference of the ICOM in 71 in Paris, Grenoble, and then in Chile, and in Santiago, the roundtable of the UNESCO. And then we looked at the issues of territories and inhabitants, and in a broader context that didn't deal only with museums, but if we consider, founders in the world of urbanism, and we see participation there, we have to go really right back to the end of the 60s. It's still a bit theoretical. The inhabitants of the city actually participated in some policy making, and also theorizing the scale of participation by the American Wallenstein and a sociologist, Sherry Arnstein, who looked at this question not for museums, but in the urban realm as well. And that goes back up to 69, actually. And then in the 2000s, for not just for the society museums, but in the French context, and European context, you have to wait quite a few years because of regulatory or issues or legislation. We had to wait a while before this legislation actually emerged regarding this problem of participatory work. And of course, I'm not going to go into that much because the participants this evening all know this context well. But we were talking about community a moment ago, and this term of community is omnipresent at the UNESCO conferences, of course, and the Faro Convention as well. And then in 2007, the Declaration of Cultural Rights in Freiburg. And participatory work already was apparent in the Declaration of Human Rights. And so we were just taking up and honing it down and giving details, breaking it down, and especially regarding heritage. And here I just wanted to look at this issue of heritage, because in the spirit of heritage and a lot of discussion, we can broaden this notion of a heritage, and it is central in the idea of ecomuseology. And we talked about new museologies or new museums or social museology or others, which of course now goes back 50 years. And so the eco-museology goes well understood and worked on now. And what I wanted to talk about this evening, and maybe this is why I wanted to talk to you about hindrances, and it was emphasized a moment ago that all of the difficulties and obstacles that we come up against when we talk about participation. This question of this big gap that we see today between the declarations of intent that are combined in the literature and that comes out of UNESCO, and some of it's still not ratified by France for reasons that are linked to the French Constitution and with respect to the French political culture that has a problem of integrating this issue of community because we go into communitarism when we take that route in France. And also the collection and the threat for participation. Of course, Hugo Verrin actually said that the drama of eco museums is that they became eco museums, and how the project emerged in the beginning of the 70s within the context of the definition of museums that was being borne by those who were putting it forth at the time. And it actually evolved toward an institutionalization or standardization of the ecomuseal utopia. And in 2015, when Hugo Verrin actually spoke, and he had quite severe words and terms regarding what ecomuseums had become. And at the same time, this question, the expression that he used, that it threatened participation in a much broader sense. And at the same time, he also said readily that it's not destined to live forever, contrary to what a museum should do, which is be very sustainable over a long period. So I will be looking at a certain number of questions that were raised in the first exhibit or presentation. Now, hindrances, of course, are important to look at in order to be able to handle the issues with respect to participatory work. And there is the issue of sharing skills, and someone like Jean Marais, who worked a lot on various publics and participation, looked at how participation was motivated by motives of emancipation, of sharing knowledge, and on the other hand, regulations and how to work all of the energies and get them to working together. And so there's this difficulty of asking how to distribute knowledge and know-how and to cross borders that aren't very easy to define at times. Also, we spoke about employees and the vocabulary we use. Sometimes we had to look at that carefully, the vocabulary that we use when we talk about experience, especially the question of the difference that we can make between mediation and participation, even though mediation in museums is mostly through dialogue, which is participatory in itself. And for me, the difference is in the role that we give to the person. And if we start falling over into participation, and then we're looking at the public and how they participate, and if we look at the player instead of the visitor, and if how to distinguish player and players and the employees who are the professionals of the museums. And so the question that we had raised earlier, decision makers and the elected representatives, council members, etc. In the projects of ecomuseums, there are various commissions, the science commissions or committee. There are various committees, the user committee, and on the question of who actually participates through and behind this question, there's a series of items that I mentioned. Who are we speaking to when we are talking about a certain public in terms of participatory work? And one of the aspects of it is speaking to the participant in the neighborhood councils, for example, and people that actually gravitate throughout institutions, friends of the museum, etc. And it often is this Alexandre Delage who presided that meeting and was director of Ecomuseum in Fresnes. And if I have time to say a few words here, he also actually questioned the fact that, you know, you have publics that are, you know, quite distanced. And then there's popular education, insertion, and all of these words doesn't really enhance the public because they're already publics of a certain social structure. And then there's the artistic side when you work with the artist, and that's different still. And so what seems quite important to me is that on these issues is that we haven't worked enough on these, because there's the huge question of evaluating the participatory projects. And one of the difficulties in evaluating them and the characteristics or features of these projects are that it's not that we know where we're going to get to, but what's inherent to these projects is perhaps the characteristic of shared projects rather than something that's all traced in advance, and that you know exactly where you're going and what results you have in advance. And so I discovered the work of a sociologist called Juliette Malpin, who also has worked on the motivations of people who were called on to participate and the level of participation, what brings them uh, to come in and participate, and what motivates a person to want to participate in museum work. And personal motivations, especially to show it's not necessarily cultural projects. It's the civic aspect. It's the work of a citizen, for example. It's fulfilling, and the sociability as well. And it's interesting to see exactly what brings a person in to want to work with the museum. And the broader question behind that is actually the question of methodology and information and training, rather. Yes, we spoke briefly of training. We should know, is it going to be part of the museum employees training to bring in this aspect of participatory work with the community? And so maybe we should look closely at distinguishing between the skills and knowledge of museum professionals, and when we come to the border, where it's borderline with respect to skills and knowledge. My personal experience would be to say that we really it would be of interest for us, very relevant to integrate methods that are used in popular education, methods and systems. And there too, the museums should recall these means of working, and which would enable us to go right through to participatory projects with tools, and trying to respond in advance to this question of intent and motivation, and just how far are we willing to go in this scale of participation, and how can we share knowledge and know-how. And so this takes a lot of experience, actually, and sharing skills. I think I've gone over. I've gone over time. No, that's fine. You can continue. You've got a bit of time left. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I know how difficult it is when one is moderator, and so we try to stay within the time limit. And so I won't be able to go into maybe I can't go into too much detail for all of these various activities. It would be too long, but perhaps to just speak of briefly, I'll try to be concise. The ecomuseum of the Grand Orly Saint-Brieuve, we've changed the name, and maybe I can talk about the one in Montreal, the ecomuseum of the Fairmont in Montreal, and this started up in the mid-70s, and they did a participatory status and an inventory of participatory projects as well. So maybe we can come back to this question, and also we can, maybe I can just bring up this topic of something I did in Lyon when I was in charge for a few years, and that it's not the reason, which is not a museum, it's the Fresnes and Vermont museums that had the collections, and the Ries doesn't have a collection, just archives, but they still do some collection for shared projects. And it was important to note that the method they used was to train the teams of these in the same way as they did educated and trained groups of population. And maybe we could look at what they do in those areas. And maybe I can go to this present adaptation, perhaps
one thing that I find very interesting is this desire to propose something and to make progress in that direction. This requires a certain experimental approach. We need to be a little bit adventurous. As we said earlier, these projects are often very temporary. But the more of these projects we have, one after the other, the institution acquires knowledge and know-how and is able to maintain relationships and ties with the people who have participated. This builds ways of working over time. One of my biggest professional discoveries in recent years in my career has been this management and governance of the institution itself. It's as if the institution cannot go into these participatory projects through these questions of sharing power and decisions. I really appreciated this idea that we talked about earlier about making conflict productive. Yes, we're talking about democracy here. The definition of democracy that Paul Ricard gives, this is something that I learnt off by heart during my training in popular education institution. A society that recognizes itself as divided, implements measures for reconciliation and mediation. That's more or less the definition. There are conflicts. There is this risk of failure if we do not integrate these aspects in order to move forward. We're not really in a participatory approach. The last thing I would like to say this evening is that I do believe that despite everything, if we come back to a more contemporary context now, things have changed. It's no longer the utopia of the 1960s, and drawing on these universal human rights from the 1960s can come into issues now. This is what we've seen, these phenomena of individualism, social media allowing anybody to share their opinions, these questions of skills and legitimacy associated with scientific or professional know-how have been somewhat fragilized and weakened through this context. And paradoxically, sharing authority within this context is even harder. Some institutions have been shaken by the questioning of their legitimacy even before these participatory approaches. So how can we feel strong enough on our laurels, on our foundations, as lenders, as financial institutions, in order to enter into dialogue with populations? That's everything that I wanted to say today. Thank you, Xavier. This was so rich. This reminds me of my life and my career when I was director of a museum. And I remember we were working with Yvon de Saint-Denis and the museum of Thiamond in 2013, where we had a symposium on the museum and its collections. The Museum of the City, the Musée de la Ville, has evolved. We can see policy changing. We heard earlier that ecomuseums will have an end. The Museum of the City which was really seen as really modern at the time, is now switching into more of a museum of design. I have a question that I would like to ask you. The question of objects in eco-museums or society museums is really essential. And I wanted to ask about participation around objects. I know that you often have collections or donations, a request to collect a number of different objects for an exhibition, which is a means of participation. Have we already seen, or in the future, will we be able to have a non-discriminatory participatory collection, which could then become part of the museum's collections and an exhibition? If a museum should be really participatory, does this mean that collections do not necessarily need to be led by curators and scientists within the exhibition? What's your opinion about this? Because I think this question will be raised increasingly. Yes, this question needs to be discussed. We're working in heritage. If I think about this within an eco-museum mindset, objects refer to the heritage approach. Heritage, which is seen as a process of transmission and passing down knowledge, even through an image of intangible cultural heritage. I think that heritage is intangible. If you look at the UNESCO definition, they talk about objects and artifacts as means of transmission. The issue, in my opinion, would be to consider how to designate heritage. There are lots of structures that have experimented with this kind of situation. If I think about Fiermonde, for instance, this was quite recent. In 2001, one of the museums developed a participatory approach, which wasn't to have donations immediately come into the collection. It's not to enrich the collections of the museum. People were asked to bring objects that they believed were important for transmission without necessarily wanting to include them in the collection. Some people gave spontaneous gifts, and the Eco Museum of Fiermonde developed a similar scheme. Collaboration between the two institutions led to a kind of eco-museum collection protocol, which consists of listing objects that aren't necessarily included in the museum's collections themselves, but for which a certain responsibility is allocated. If we focus on the process and the implementation and protocols and institutions, researchers, academics to look at objects and assess the heritage value, if that process is organized, an object could be considered worthy of being kept, which would require negotiation, and then curators would be able to keep that for the purposes of transmission. But particularly from an ethnographic perspective, objects on themselves do not have any value unless they are accompanied by discourse. People who contribute to collections often bring their own objects. There's a lot of storytelling around that. Lots of museums do this. And then they add them to the French museums collection or the national collections. Perhaps we need to develop processes and take the time to do this. Perhaps we need periods during which objects are conserved in their place of origin. This is perhaps an initial response to the question of permanent versus temporary. I have a Quebecois experience about household heritage, for instance. Here, this is a vision that positions the institution differently. It's not a central approach. It's more as a catalyst to encourage heritage action among people who are no longer just the public, they become citizens and agents in the action. I think that this question of objects in participatory approaches will be something we'll be looking at for many years now. We will discover so many things, I am sure. Thank you so much, Xavier. I'm now going to hand over to Lina Tahan. I'm sorry if I am mispronouncing your name. Lina has a PhD in archaeology and museology from the University of Cambridge in the UK. She currently works there as a research affiliate. Until recently, she worked in the department of archaeology at the Lebanese University. She is president of the International Committee for Ethical Dilemmas. Thank you so much for coming to share with us. And she works primarily on the promotion of museums in the Arab world. Her research and teaching interests cover many fields. Let me mention a few. It's not in the right order, of course. Issues of representation in Middle Eastern museum collections, exhibitions, and visitors, the history of collections and museum development in Lebanon in the political context, the definition of heritage in Lebanon and its link to identity formation and the creation of a sense of belonging, and the role of museums in promoting understanding in divided societies. There's a lot that we'll be able to learn here. So Lina basically says that there are two categories of museums. I'm trying to faithfully present what she says, but there are those that give a voice to the public and those that want to control discourse represented within an exhibition. So how can we ensure the presence of the public, and what are the initiatives and challenges for the public so that they can participate in this inclusive museum experience? To answer this question, Lina will talk to us about another aspect of participation. Here we'll be talking about ethics, which is a current challenge in museums. She'll go as far as to question possible political perspectives and the way to apprehend the relationship between the institution and the public. So I'm going to hand over to Lina now to discuss these ethical components in participatory actions within museums. Lina, over to you. Thank you so much, Marie-Laure, for presenting my subject. This is a really big subject, and following our meeting, I've decided to really focus on a very important project, ICEthics, which we've been working with an international committee on at ICOM. This is a very important project that we've been working on. It's had a lot of people involved. Although I have not worked on this project, I would love to present it to you. This is ICEthics. And this may be able to give you some ideas for the researchers and museologists who are here today. Thank you very much, ICOM France, for inviting me as president of ICEthics in order to present and be with you this evening in order to present my project. Can you see my slides? We can just see your desktop. We can't see your slides. What about now? No. Try to stop it and then start it again, and you should be able to select which window, which screen you want to show. Okay, I'll try to stop it and relaunch it. Is it working yet? Normally you should be able to select presentation mode or desktop. Can you see see it now or not? No, not yet. Sorry, I'm just trying to share my screen. Can you see my slides now? Yes, it's working. Yes, can you see it now? Excellent, thank you. So the purpose of my presentation is to urge museum professionals to rethink public participation and what it can offer to museums. Unfortunately, across our world, as has been said, there are two categories of museums, those that give voice to their audiences and those that want to control the discourses represented through a museum exhibition. This means, for example, that museums in the Middle East do not have a possibility to get the public involved. It is always a decision, like Emilie said previously, it's the curators that have to make that decision. They always say no. And there are other museums in Europe that give a voice to their visitors in order to participate and be active agents. This is part of our ethical duty to be responsible to our public. And as a researcher, I always ask myself the following question. How can we ensure the presence of the public, and what are the initiatives and challenges for the public to participate in this inclusive experience? This evening, I chose to talk to you about an ICEthics project, which is with COMCOL, and it's designed around the importance of public involvement in museum decisions about contemporary collections during the COVID-19 pandemic. I've chosen this topic because through the recent health, social and economic crises and other crises that we are experiencing in our world, many organizations such as museums or collections like archives and universities have faced these ethical challenges. This is leading them to re-examine and change their way of working. From the start of this crisis, many institutions developed projects for collecting and recording this extraordinary situation that we experienced. However, this contemporary collection of objects faced a number of old and new ethical issues, such as transparency, the collection of traumatic matter, informed consent, environmental sustainability, respect and human dignity, urgency, and damages and the representation of groups that have been historically marginalized, which were the most affected by the pandemic. So this evening, I would like to discuss the following. So what was this project? Which partners were involved? What are the objectives? What were the challenges and the lessons learned? How did the project respond to the health crisis? And how could this project be adapted to other scenarios or replicated by other ICOM committees? I would now like to present the logo of this project, Collecting with Care, Ethics in Museum Work. I unfortunately cannot show you photos given copyright, as all of the information published on the ICEthics and COMPOL websites are YouTube videos. There are hours and hours of webinars that you'll be able to watch. And during those, all of the participants present their photos, but unfortunately, I do not hold copyright over those photos and I'm unable to show you them. So to present the project and the main actors involved now is COMCOL and ICEthics. The project was funded by ICOM. So it's a very innovative project that brought together 7 different museums, Taco Network for collection management and contemporary documenting in Finland, the Casa de la Memoria Museum, District 6 Museum, MIO, Illinois State Museum, National Australian Museum, and a consortium of institutions from Taiwan. The project had 2 phases. The first was a survey, which was carried out via questionnaires on the challenges institutions faced during the pandemic and or similar traumatic events in the past. And secondly, we organized a series of webinars to engage participants in more in-depth discussions on their experiences and needs. In the initial plans, we had hoped to culminate this effort with the creation of a specific website where all resources were collected. But unfortunately, this was not possible during the current period, but we will continue to make efforts for this to happen. The main objectives of this project were to bring together museum professionals from different institutions around the world and engage them in critical reflection and discussion around these topics. This is a way of creating a community or a network of practice and support while engaging in a global dialogue around the ethics of collection. How can we collect? How can we achieve this? The first aim was to initiate international dialogue on collection during the pandemic and concomitant crises. And secondly, to identify and discuss critically and openly the ethical decisions that need to be made in this type of project. Thirdly, we wanted to create an online resource and repository, a reference document, which museums could use to develop their contemporary collection programs ethically. Fourthly, we wanted to contribute to the development of training resources for programs focusing on the ethics of contemporary collecting. I would just like to give you an example now. Like I said, I don't have access to the photos, but you can all see them on the TACA network. If you look at the TACA network website and their YouTube channel, or the ICEthics and Comcol websites. The TACA network in Finland decided from the offset, right at the start of lockdown, to interview border police in Uusimaa. They started to collect stories and the challenges that they were faced because the borders had been closed. Secondly, they decided to work in the surgery in local hospital, which was a very major initiative. There was a real risk of going and doing this field work. So they interviewed surgeons and nurses. Collection was not just interviews, it was also about collecting masks, gloves, visors, everything linked to the pandemic. This project really caught my attention compared with other projects. It was a very challenging project for them. It took a lot of time, but they really managed to step up to these challenges and document the pandemic, which was very important. So if we look now at the lessons that we learned during this project, it was a very ambitious and very large project, but it was also a learning experience for all of the participants and also the curators and museum directors who took part. The challenge was that there were different museums working in different time zones under different legal and financial regimes, which made the organization of these activities much more complicated than we initially thought. So how did this project respond to the health crisis? The project responded by providing 2 important components. Firstly, by providing practical ideas from other institutions on collecting, especially collecting in and for the pandemic. And secondly, it provided a safe collegial space to share concerns and think about these practices in order to support the well-being of museum professionals. The abbreviated name of this project, Collecting with Care, has double meaning. Firstly, collecting ethically, but also to care for and give consideration to museum professionals who've had to go out and collect on behalf of their institutions during a very difficult time for society as a whole, but also for themselves as individuals and members of the community. So how could this project be adapted or reused, replicated by other ICOM committees, whether it's other pandemics, other crises? So firstly, it's about networking, building relationships, and involving as many professionals as possible in current debates. This has been the main purpose of this project. The objectives can be adopted in any project, regardless of the ICOM committee, and for any project that they're organizing. The networks we've created throughout this project are networks that are ready to be used for the dissemination of other projects and ideas. In terms of the methodologies we've used, such as the field survey or the webinars, these methods were widely used during the pandemic and continue to be used to this day. I'd like to give you some YouTube video links now that you can visit. I would like to say that we are a committee that wants to get ICOM members involved, regardless of the country they come from. We want you to talk to us about any ethical problem that you encounter. We are also happy to let you speak through webinars or the meeting rooms that we organize, so that you can present your issues and the discussions that you would like to talk to us about. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you so much, Lina. Thank you for telling us about this project, which is something that we are all touched by as we all experienced this pandemic. I have 3 questions. Firstly, were any institutions reluctant to take part in this project? Did anyone turn it down? Or was everybody enthusiastic? In terms of the institutions invited, none of them turned it down. The project was submitted to ICOM for selection. So it was Komkol, Alexandra, who is a researcher in Greece, and 2 members of the board of the committee working with us, along with our former president, who was able to work in this. It was selected. Museums were selected because they wanted to take part. If we had opened doors towards the UK or France, the project would have been much more ambitious and it would have taken much more time. But this does not mean that the project could not be replicated in these areas. It was a big challenge for the field surveys, first of all, in order to collect all of the data and then to open that up. As you can see through the webinars, they were incredibly well organized. We published them on both of our websites because it was very important to see how each country faced different challenges, what they wanted to select, how they wanted to collect. The example of Finland really did catch my attention because the field work meant that they were working with frontline workers, the doctors, the ambulance drivers, the nurses. And for instance, there were ethical issues when doctors and nurses did not want curators to say things that were ethically compromised with regard to patients. They I really respected the way that they worked with their participants. They gave a voice to these people so that they could say what's happening on the ground. And that's really important. And that's why I wanted to present this project, to tell you what we've been doing in ICEthics and the sort of project that we support. And it is incredibly important to participate. It's very important because in many countries, we do not have a voice to say what's happening. Visitors are not able to say if we were able to exhibit this thing or that thing. But unfortunately, there's a political control. I know that many colleagues have been faced with job loss, for instance, because the politicians in their country do not agree with their viewpoint. I did not want to present this today because it's a whole other discourse, but I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that there are a lot of challenges in museums. Not all museums are open, especially during the pandemic. A lot of people lost their jobs because museums were unable to open. But at the same time, it opened our eyes as professionals and researchers.
To we questions, what topic would you imagine for today? You know, if you had to, could you think of other topics that this could be applied to? Well, for another project of solidarity, in view of the name, also this top project to incite participants to be involved. So there are both. So first of all, we learned lessons from this. We drew a few lessons. And one major one was to integrate this idea into contemporary history of what's happening today, for example. That's very important. Now, I think that given that Xavier and Emilie both spoke of the importance of participation in museums, ecomuseums, for example, Jean de Vivière was very innovative. How can we be innovative and really bring in these visitors every day and have them actively involved? Art museums and archaeological museum is a bit different. We can learn from this. We can go out in the field and work. That's very important, but we also have the problem of resources. And can we ask for funds for another project of solidarity, for example? Yes, that can be done. We can apply methods, the surveys, etc., and encourage our museums to really move forward to do something new. Yes, that's possible. Yes, for sure. But how to have these people really participate, that is something we really have to work on. We see this with our children at school, how we do things. I'm really sorry to say so, but I have a child in school. I usually go together to see how they have the children participate in museums. Museums. I often go with them just to see, and it's really sad to see. And so if we really want to incite them and to have our children, the future generations, to be involved, we really have to encourage this kind of work that is done at the schools. And we must open our museums to others, not just come in and visit. No, try to do it. I think people like Emilie and myself, we work on other topics and other issues, identity, etc. A lot of researchers do insist on this. Because the researchers in museology also must bring what they can. These are researchers; they're not people like who work in the museums. That's different. Sometimes their hands are tied and they don't have the right to say certain things. Whereas we, as researchers in the background, we have the right to say and to speak out. So that's a right that we have. That I'm not a curator. I am a researcher. And so just a wee word, just a figure, if you like. I think we'll all have the time to look at this. What would you advise us for example, as in terms of webinars, the TAC network, it's 1.5 hours long, because the other one was 6 hours. The one from Australia was a 6-hour one. And so try to watch that one, because it brings you right through. And, before getting the money for this project, they took the initiative of doing the collection, and it really was innovative on their part to actually do that and document one specific period of history that's very important, so that we don't become amnesiac. And even when you try to document it, a lot of people, a lot of countries actually undergo amnesia for certain topics. Yes, thank you very much, Lina, then. And so now we can have 15 minutes, very short 15 minutes, but 15 minutes nevertheless, so that we can have discussions on the chat box, and we can just stop for a while. So if you have questions, raise your hands as you know how to, and then I have questions on the chat box. I wanted to come back to Pierre Pénicaud's comment, because maybe you don't know that in 2021 and 22, they did a heritage program, a huge study on citizens and inhabitants participation. So I don't know if Pierre wanted to say something, and he added that then there was a legal guide on this topic that was extremely useful for the projects that were conducted. Yes, Pierre, if you wanted to say, well, yes, I'll let you read the report if you wish, and all of the major pieces of information. Well, actually, all of the heritage, it was really a transversal, a cross-cutting view of heritage for historical monuments, archaeology. It's a little bit different in each our heritage area. And so what I wanted to say was that following this report and this study, that actually we conducted 250 interviews, and we organized a symposium in 2022, which was half, a visio conference, half distance, or whatever we could do in the COVID period there. And then this legal guide on participation in terms of heritage and museums, how to receive volunteer workers and participants. It's not exactly the same thing. We said that a bit in our report, that it's not exactly the same thing, and we'll be continuing this adventure for a special edition in situ, actually. So we'll be continuing in this vein, and it's not ready yet. It's written, it's translated into English, as a matter of fact. And so we can ask Emilie and others as well, because it's important for other countries other than France to participate. And then we'll try to get it into the network through Emilie and Marie-Laure. Okay. Yes, so you can count on us. We will disseminate this information. Also, Lina, the Comcol project, the collections of each museums were shared, or did they stay in each respective country? Well, no, I don't think they're shared already myself. First of all, I should say that they wanted to translate the project in several languages, at least three, the three languages of the ICOM, French, English, Spanish. And of course, no, it wasn't done. And I wanted to show you that it's not on the site either any longer. So I don't, it's out of my hands now. and I've written to get news, but I haven't heard anything back. So I think each museum collected its own artifacts and they stayed in their own museums. Did they exhibit it or did they keep it? Or I don't know. If I should contact each individual museum or not. But yes, I thought it was good to do the webinar just to show that each country. I did this field work and the collection work, but I think I don't think it was as much an artifact collection as a record, actually. And for actually and working of the nurses, for example, at this period. But other than that, I can't say much more. And I don't know if we'll really be publishing it in a book form. I think it's a shame that we not be able to do it and have more information for the researchers that really do wish to know more on those projects, because it really was a very innovative project. And I wish really to talk to you about this. And on this platform, I went on it for the ICOM. And since we were given a space to speak, I thought it was a really good participatory initiative. And I hope that the person who asked this question, that everything I placed on the site, and somebody has asked me in this chat book if I couldn't share it again, maybe the last slide, perhaps. Yes, actually, during the questions, yes, we did it. And so maybe we should continue if the topic of the collection, and if you're interested in it, this is the advertising moment here. Here it is. The museum, what are we talking about? I don't know if you can see this, but I'll read it. It was dedicated to gather the traces of the COVID-19 as we experienced it right through to June of 2021. And so it's online if you would like to see it in more detail. So I just want to see if there are any other questions. I have comments. From Corinne on training of teachers and raising awareness within schools and how important it is, and the importance in research of museums, the importance of research in museums rather. And Moll informs us that the call for communications is already happening. So that's a breaking news information here for contributions, a call for contributions. And here's another question regarding methodology of design thinking, which is more and more being offered in calls for calls for tender. So I didn't know anything more about this, but actually we practice it a lot in the museum. This method. Are there any people who have practiced this in participative work? I have in other contexts, but not in a participatory context. Does anybody wish to say something about this? Can you hear me? Yes, good evening. I would like to give my account. It's not the point of view of the institution, but just it happens a lot in the calls for tender. I ask the question, and we do set up this method when we want to speak of new aspects of the institution, identities, branding, or if we go from the PSC or to build it, and also to rework the curriculum, for example, or the programming rather. And we, try to work with the general public and looking for activities and setting up methods so that we can involve the public in these projects regarding the program or identity. So I don't know if you do these, if you have in your museums set up something like that. I'm speaking as a consultant, actually. Okay, Gwinnett, I just wanted to see, can you give us your name, please? Yes, Gwenelle Le Querec. I'm a senior cynologist, and I specialize in public work, and it's called, I've worked in Strasbourg and for the Cité of Architecture, and we do studies of the general public, and this is, we try to really involve the public on a large scale. And we work a lot on the master plan, for example, and the problems of a master plan. And we work on various topics, either a curator or the program, or even with the exhibit, the course of the exhibit as you go through. Actually, in a lot of museums and eco-museums that work with groups that are well identified, really actually in the way that of their objectives to be reached, not necessarily the methodology, but we've worked together with Marine, but also we work with smaller groups to try to handle a certain number of things, but not in this specific methodology here. Okay, well, maybe we'll go to the second part then. Well, the first speaker of the second part of our session is Annabelle Ténèze. Annabelle Ténèze is the chief curator of heritage and general manager of the Abattoirs Museum in Toulouse. And she was a former student of the National School in Chartres and the National Institute of Heritage, and was the curator in charge of the Office of Graphic Arts at the National Picasso Paris Museum from 2006 to 2012. And then she was head of the Contemporary Art Museum in Haute-Vienne at the Chateau de Rochechouart from 2012 to 2016. And amongst her research, she was interested in defining the scenes, historic and present scenes, for reasons of visibility and when you are not visible. And so she did painting with the Contemporary Art Museum of Rochefoucauld and the Fine Arts in Dole, and also African paintings with the African contemporary artists. Also, she developed new relationships with the public in the work at the Frac and co-building of networks throughout the territory, and working on direct dialogue with visitors of museums. There is a gallery for the public, which institutes workshops and does exhibits for 30 different places in Occitanie. And actually at the Abattoir Museum, she'll be talking about, how do we ask the public to choose the pieces of fine arts, for example. And are we supposed to pre-select the works? Are we supposed to orient and direct the choices? And also, what are the limits, the freedom that we offer to the public? And Annabelle will tell us about the genesis of where her adventure started. Annabelle, it's yours. Yes, good evening. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Marie-Lan, for this presentation. And thank you to the ICOM for having allowed me to present this project. And why is participation so important for the Abattoir Museum and the Frac in general? I'm talking about that because I think it's also through this that brought us to the exhibit that's called "It's Up to You to Choose." And so today I, have chosen this in the participatory manner. The choice is yours, rather. And also, how about the FRAC in activities and throughout the region, and how they are really at the very basis of the participative projects at the Abattoir Museum, and also how some artists, because we are a place of contemporary art, and so actually this brings us on board and them on board our participatory projects. And so I'm coming back to the last point that you mentioned regarding the Abattoir Museum. It started in the year 2000, which was a contemporary art museum. And so it has the contemporary collection, the West Occitanie part today. And in the design of this Abattoir Museum, fundamentally, there were some elements of participation already, which made it so that the abattoir had approximately the same number of visitors, about 150,000 on site, but also 150,000 people that had touched upon these activities throughout the region. And so this is an institution that works on having the public come to to the Abattoir Museum, but also to bring the originals and exhibits and discussion on the works to the offsite, so out throughout the community. And so that also is a basis of our work. And there we also put forth quite strongly in the regional dissemination, the co-building with our partners, because we don't work in the same work and they won't work in the same way when we're in a school, for example, with the teachers who are, linked up with the teaching projects, for example, as when we go to a retirement home, for example, a home for the aged, or to a library or another social institution. And so we don't work in the same way in all of these various places. And we originally started a gallery for the public and of the public that also actually recovers projects and works on projects with associations within the framework of workshops or delocalized workshops, displaced, and with publics that have a hindrance and can't get to us. And so these are the different ways that we do co-constructing. And in this participatory work, on the next slide, we came to this thought process of what really defines this Abattoir Museum. And we didn't really work on it in the same way as we had imagined, because in the 20 years, the anniversary was supposed to be in June of 2020. And so it wasn't the best time to celebrate its anniversary. But we did want to invite 20 partners from outside our walls to choose certain works of our collection, and only 2 were able to take place. And also we asked the question, why in these collections that we have within the building, and also the strong relations that we have with our partners, and actually outside of our walls, we have strong teaching and training on how to choose a theme, what actually makes up an exhibit, where's the spot to do it, and how to get the public there. So actually we thought that we do this co-building, but we did it outside of our walls, but not inside our walls. And so right in our museum, if this is the way to build, and this 20th anniversary year, we should be doing it. And this is why this exhibit took place 2 years later. And in the same way, to have this participative exhibit, it was also a way to say, well, how and do we have a participatory approach? And of course, we had one person from each of the departments of the Abattoir Museum. We took them and we said, well, based on a collection that has several thousand artworks, how can we build a project? And there were a lot of questions that arose from that time on. And then there was a little provocative point that one visitor or user made us notice that from the 1960s, somebody noticed that there was an old black man that was doing one action and a Japanese woman who was making wheels. And so how do we share our works with the public that of which the majority doesn't really have the notion of art that we do? And so how to support that and guide that along? And what public will we be excluding by choosing such a means? And so, as you see, there is a sort of paperwork or wallpaper with everything on it. And so we did 2 votes. And so the types of votes that we had one type of voting that was directly at the Abattoir Museum with a name. And this great big, huge sort of wallpaper, if you wish, where we had these chosen works, and also another one where we had these works, we had 58 of them. And so our approach was to say that we will be putting forth the images mostly, and underneath the legends, and then we should be able to download the notices, or upload them rather, and so you can visualize them. And then we raise the question of how how many works can be digested by a certain public, and we had to look at our database. Despite the force and power, it might not be what is being looked for. And so we worked on a figure which was an ideal figure for the time spent on watching some works, and so it was 50 or 58. And then how can we have a representative lot of works? And so we, first of all, went and had everyone choose 10 works. And they chose 10. And then with the view that each group actually threw on these works and how they looked upon them. And then we had, we contemplated them, that there was parity, male, female, and the selection itself, and having a mix between the works that seemed very, very old in the collection and the more recent works, because obviously what was this good for, this basket of works, that we could explain what the collection meant, and practicing a collection, what collecting actually consisted of, and also maybe why some of the works that some people really liked a lot wasn't included in this basket. because maybe it was in restoration or whatever. And so maybe some collections aren't very well known by our visitors. And also, this had us think about the last point I wanted to say, that the system of vote was you had to choose three, and we had this you had to choose, and we wanted it to be not too long for each person, but with the legend and the information below the work, we wanted to invite all of them to the opening night, to the premiere of the preview. And we wanted them to be there. And so we wanted to have the quotes to be able to be expressed on the voting chit, to see, when they cast their vote. And we wanted to know if they authorized us to share what they said.
In order to get into a dynamic where the voters can see the results of their votes in a relatively short time frame, the choice was made to show the exhibition 3 months after the selection. It was quite funny because every now and again we would look at the survey and see which works were towards the top in order to estimate the scenography as quickly as possible. That's something that perhaps is still a little bit difficult to explain. A sociologist will be able to explain it. We did not have the same result. The favorite artwork was everybody's, but we do not have the same ranking depending on the paper and online voting. This was something that really shows us something of sociology going on behind the scenes, or perhaps something else. We had around 900 votes, just over. And this was an excellent number for us. So there was an urn where people could put their votes, and some wallpaper, and we kept that for a little bit of time as well. Here are some photos of the exhibition. This is the artwork that won online and on site. It says reality does not exist. This was a Toulousan collective, IEP. This was originally a trailer designed for being on the roads. And this is juxtaposed here. And you can see how the artist selected, this is juxtaposed with another artwork, and you can see how different all of the different pieces of art are. We asked ourselves a question, because this participatory exhibition also resembles a classic scenography, Pierre Soulages, a relatively classic exhibition. And that was something quite surprising for us. Spontaneously, we were able to reconstitute, I forgot to say, but there were 18 pieces of art that were selected. These were the top ranked 18 which were presented. We had not selected an initial number of art because we did not know the format or the size of the artwork. We therefore decided to choose this number later. We paradoxically, almost despite ourselves, built a traditional exhibition through the artworks that were selected. Here you can see quotations that accompanied all of the different artworks. Each came with a quotation. Here you can see quite classic quotations. Something that says, for instance, I do not know why this artwork touches me so much, but it is extraordinary, discovering light in the dark. And we put the name of the person, and we put the place where they came from. On the right, there's an artwork of a piece of glass, and the quotation says, a glass hanging in the balance, fragility of our water resources on the earth. The artwork itself did not necessarily have this ecological perspective, but this is something that one of the visitors identified. Here it's Selina, who's 58 years old. So it's interesting to see the interpretations that people have had. And this was a choice to present these almost as if they were by the artists themselves in quite a classic way. Let's move on to the next choice. Here you can see a photographer. It was important to show that there was César. It's a big name in the art world, but then also younger contemporary artists. Two of the artists had not yet exhibited here. This is a strong signal saying that sometimes we think that people are going to choose certain pieces of art, but actually we were mistaken. Sometimes the public chose different artworks, and this was quite exciting. Let me just show you one final view of the exhibition now. Jamal Tatar, and in the background you can see a neon sign as well, and two citations, quotations that were a little bit more funny, a little bit personal. Someone who's saying, I like cats, that's why I chose these cats. Or another that talks about how these older women made sense to somebody, brought meaning into her life. It was quite a strong and surprising experience that modified our reflection, the pace of it, the discussions about what a participatory exhibition can be, like this one here. How can we do this again? We had a voting system this time, but is this something that we should be using each time? Not necessarily. I think that we need to think about this. As we asked previously, how can we continue to integrate these practices little by little outside of these events? Let's move on to the next slide, because this is important. It was important for me to show you how, to a certain extent, the exhibitions and the actions carried out outside and in this exhibition hall, in any case, they've always been working in a participatory manner. And let me give you three examples. On the top left, this is our program with school institutions. It's called One Institution, One Artwork. This gives around 30 schools the opportunity of having art in their schools through a call for projects. Another two examples. On the right-hand side, you can see an exhibition that we have been working with in a number of retirement homes located around this gallery. In this example, you can see an exhibition called Born of Exile. And we also had an exhibition with the psychologists working with these residents. A number of pieces of art are proposed to residents where they have to talk about the themes they choose, works of art, which are then able to visit, but then also there's work and exchange and discussion with the residents of retirement homes and their psychologists. The other photo that you can see on the bottom right is a program that we especially enjoyed. This was at the initiative of Saint-Aubin, which is a district in Toulouse. It was during the pandemic. One of the people in this association living in this district is someone who knew our programs from the schools program that we had, and he's since retired. He contacted the team at Frac because he wasn't happy. He was shocked that we weren't considered essential services as museums. So he suggested that we build a local district museum, which we completed in 2022. So 14 local retailers each presented a work of art selected from the collection of the Abattoir Gallery in their store. So there was one in the optician, or one in a cycle store. So here we're not just sharing the collection. This is a form of mediation as well, of outreach. Paris Gaucher had this work of art. And so then he was able to explain why he chose it, why it was there. It's a way of sharing a collection and providing mediation. These three examples are part of this issue. We have talked a lot about this exhibition. It's up to you to choose, but here we have something much more long-term, much less temporary, with co-construction involved. Let me show you the final example now. I thought that it was interesting to show the three modes of participation and exchange. We also considered participation within an exhibition about Shona Illingworth, Topologies of Air. So it's when participation becomes part of an artwork by an artist and how we can get involved with that. So Shona Illingworth is a Danish and French artist who's working on a major project that will lead to a presentation of a human rights sky protection to the UN. So it contains photographs, and a lot of her research is about heavenly tribunals and courts organized in different countries so that she can collect specialist discourse and testimony in order to demonstrate different approaches to the skies, the heavens. This can be talking to specialist scientists, specialists in space, shamans, religious experts. And throughout the exhibition, the idea is that individuals can take part in the future assembly of the sky in the Abattoir Gallery. This assembly of the skies suggested that people could leave a note, but not just anywhere, a note on a bit of paper where a question is asked. And on the other side, it's a little glimpse of sky. So the sky is actually being built by people bringing a little note. So this is building something with this assembly, even though the exhibition is still ongoing, let me show you a final thing, because this is where we're mixing it in with some creativity. This is called skywall mapping. She's worked with a researcher based in Hiroshima. Let me try and find her name for you. Dr. Lou Van Das, who is a professor at the Center of Memory and Critical Heritage Studies for Peace at the University of Hiroshima. She analyzed the first series of responses from visitors by mapping them. And this mapping will help Shona Illingworth in the next stage of her exhibition. This mapping shows what the main issues are that visitors are asking themselves, and these are then going to be taken into account in her own artistic project. It's a whole other challenge. It's a way of asking ourselves that as museum managers working in cultural institutions, we're at the crossroads here with contemporary art, where we're working between artists, the public, visitors. There are 3 types of examples here that I've shown you about how we implement and are challenged differently by these 3 examples of how we can participate together with the public, how we can create this dialogue between all of the different aspects. If I say dialogue, if we do a participatory exhibition, there's an exchange of words between different people, but the question is how this can then lead to dialogue that is continued over time. I'm going to stop my presentation there. Thank you very much for listening and for listening to the different examples. Thank you very much, Annabelle. It was really interesting, but unfortunately we're running slightly behind schedule, so I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to move straight on to Laurella. There are some questions that have been asked in the chat, so hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end. I'm going to hand over now to Laurella Rinçon. Hello, Laurella, who is General Director of the MACte, a museum memorial, a Caribbean center of expression and memory of the slave trade and slavery in Guadeloupe. She is a heritage curator, and her research in the history of arts and collections from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean focuses on the modes of sociability in the plantation world. Since 1998, she has developed activities with numerous national and international institutions. She has been co-curator of the exhibition Horizons Voices from a Global Africa in Sweden. She has worked on exhibitions Benin, 5 Centuries of Royal Art, and Masks, Beauty of the Spirits at the Musée du Quai Branly. She coordinated the program Heritage of the Slave Trade and Slavery at the Ministry of Culture from 2011 to 2012, and participated in the program The Slave in the Louvre as part of Okui and Wezour's triennial. After 10 years at the Ministry of Culture, she joined the United Nations, where she continued research activities on museums and colonial legacies. And then she was a member of the jury for the African Arts and Civilizations test on the recruitment exam for heritage curators from 2015 to 2017. Laurella, today we'd like to go back to the creation of the MACte and the initial objectives of the institution. That was to be a museum exploring the history, heritages, and memories of slavery. MACte has not got the reputation of attracting the support of Guadeloupeans. It's been criticized for its size, which is seemed to be excessive, and also for its too ethereal philosophy, which the Guadeloupeans don't understand. And finally, the general bias of the permanent exhibition, which is more conceptual than historical. So she now has a new project. The ambition of this project is to propose a new identity for the MACte with Guadeloupans. The aim is to respond to their requirements. And that's what she will be trying to explain in her presentation. Laurella, over to you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, ICOM France, ICOM International, and the INP for this invitation. MACte is 8,000 kilometers away, and it is very important to give visibility to our institution. With a very young institution. We celebrated 7 years last June, and we're constantly refounding and thinking about what the institution should be and what the institution should bring to society. I am delighted to be taking part in this discussion today. I can see people I haven't seen for a very long time. Emilie Girard, Lina Tahan, a number of people with whom we started thinking about this 20 years ago. Lina, Xavier de la Selle as well. And I'm delighted to see the extent to which these participatory issues, which were just emerging 20 years ago in France through older works, that I started to engage with these topics. And this has become research subjects for a number of people. And it's interesting to see that this is now much more widespread now. This has been a real success, and it's a real source of satisfaction for myself. I'm not going to present just a single project, but instead explain how participatory museology is within the very DNA of the MACte, as the MACte is a memorial museum that wants to be a memorial museum in any case. So people looking to establish memory have a real role to play within this. I would imagine that not all of you will know the Memorial Act. This was opened in 2015 on the day of memory of slavery, on the 10th of May, which is a day that commemorates this history. This is the first cultural institution specifically dedicated to the memory of slavery in France. It was opened on the 7th of July that same year to the public, calling itself a center of expression. There was already significant debate around the idea that this could be a museum or a memorial. And the new MACte project is trying to reconcile these two. The MACte will be worked in project mode for the first 4 years, and then it became institutionalized in 2018 as a public cooperation institute with the aim of becoming a memorial museum in order to explain the history and the legacies of slavery. But MACte has a very long timeline based on individual and collective desires. It's very locally inspired with national ambition. And then there's an institution of institutional size. It's inspired locally because MACte is an old desire, deep-rooted in the Guadeloupean community. Many people have expressed this since the 1990s, the associative, artistic movements in the Black in the Black population, that wanted a museum about slavery. There have also been working groups organized by a sociologist who was president of a local committee of the UNESCO slavery group. And in 1994, a house of slavery was opened up with the creation of a route as well, linking up the different heritage sites. And 10 years later, the Regional Council of Guadeloupe decided to create a cultural institution dedicated to the memory of slavery. So in 2004, this project was born with an institution due to open in 2015. This local inspiration is also fed into by national concerns. There are a number of cultural, scientific, intellectual, and political actors involved from different territories. When slavery was recognized as a crime against humanity in 2004, that was the implementation of the National Committee of Memory of Slavery, working with people from Reunion Island and Guadeloupe. There was then a mission for the configuration of a site of memory of slavery. We can see that on a national level, all French overseas territories affected by plantations wanted to take part in discussions. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you only have about 10 minutes left. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to discuss anything afterwards. So if you can go straight to participation, that will be great. Thank you. I think I'd just like to say that there's a parallel movement in the big cities. There's museum projects in Nantes, La Rochelle, etc. I'm going to skip over the rest of the timeline, but right up to 2019, until the Foundation for the Memory of Slavery was launched, there was a real chronology, there was a timeline of events, people working individually and collectively in order to create this institution in Guadeloupe and the foundation in Paris. So the MACte has people working from the scientific, intellectual, political, and cultural communities. I'm not going to talk about the architecture, you'll have seen it, in order to go into greater detail in two areas. Firstly, to tell you about the criticism that MACte has received, and then what we're doing in response to that. The criticisms you mentioned in the introduction are real. The first public survey in 2020 showed us that 90% of visitors are tourists, which is a failure as a memorial. And it's not addressing the population that carries this memory. In 2019, we saw that there was a real crisis of governance within the MACte. This continues to this day, with questions about the place of politics within this project. Through this crisis, the local population truly showed its interest in this institution. There was a mobilization, political will that crystallizes society, showing that there's a real interest in considering issues not only associated with memory and identity, but that the institution is meaningful when it is able to carry contemporary symbolic value on a much wider level. So MACte is at the heart of real questions with the real ambition of the local communities. I'm going to go over some of the principles very quickly. These are fundamental because these crises showed us the key role that an institution can play for its population. The aim is to have an original reading, a contemporary reading that can enrich contemporary society in a nuanced way. There has been intense uptake by the artistic community with the aim of echoing some of the concerns of the community in terms of the future that they want to build. So how could we build this desire for MACte? If you move on to the next slide now.
We and so why? Because we weren't ready for all of these people. It was outside. There was a security problem, and of course the MACte. Of course, this was right on the territory of the plantation, and it symbolizes this plantation. It's not an institution that is dedicated, to the memory of the slave trade. It would have been a totally different context, but it was right on the premises, and we could, develop the architecture as we saw before. And so this essential factor had to be taken into account to see how the municipality and the collective groups could be brought in to this. And so we defined it for the 5th anniversary of the MACte. We called it MACte in us. It was in Creole and in French, MACte en nous. And it's the echo chamber for this, the Creole language and the French language actually give a balance to it all, and this institution well rooted in the territory. And so it now needs to, over the next 5 years, respond to the needs and desires of the Guadeloupean public, and to place Guadeloupe on the map of museums, and MACte en nous, MACte within us. Here is, as you can see on the screen, this is the graphic art here, and we've got the program inside the MACte lab, for example, and that's a 6th pillar. So MACte lab really didn't want to develop a research laboratory, but it's a program that actually works with curators and other museum professionals, and to see how they can invest the space. I just wanted to present a few projects very quickly. Here, the next one, for example, the MACte in Laurella, which is prefigures a children's museum, and we were able to create based on a classical workshop during carnival time. We were able to create the MACte group, MACte en Laurella, and they were creating musical instruments, costumes, and they were able to participate, this little small MACte group, and they did 2 parades in the carnival. And so another project, and here this MACte carnival project, and the next slide. So here with the residents, resident artists, for example, they work also with different age groups, and we created a workshop within the museum. We can see the next slide. This workshop enables the artist to have open workshops, and it's through these creations here they can be exhibited in the various exposition and exhibitions, but also it can be an exceptional site to work on. So these are Ronald Serial's works, and the workshops that work with teenagers, high school students on various projects. Following slides. So the MACte en parole, which means in words, and it's works around the Creole language with Creole speakers and non-Creole speakers, and it works with speaking this language, and works on creating projects with linguists such as Hector Poulet, who participates in these workshops. I'm sorry, we really have to go, otherwise we're going to be cut off. Okay, so this is a project on the Morne in the north of Guadeloupe, and this is a project that enabled us at the time of the pandemic to create a commemorative event. It was just after the pandemic in 2020, and then this project, the La Linca Claire, during our nighttime activities, we invited artists and the bearers of memory as well, and we had a young Jamaican architect who worked, and we were able to work with a huge public there. We had very good turnout because we worked with a very specific age group around this question, and the MACte also works in traditional practice. Can you just go back? I didn't have the chance to do a sentence. Okay, we're not going to get, we're going to get, but I'm going to end on this slide. Okay, yes. We actually, it's a way of enable the people to actually get a hold of the MACte and appropriate it for themselves. Actually, now we have traditional regattas and crews that work together, and this is a very important cultural event, and this enables us to get a different type of public out. And so this is very quickly what we do. So I would like to ask you to go through these slides, and it's really the emblematic program here. We had one in 2020, and then in 2022, there's another one where the artists actually take over the exhibit spaces and create dialogue to bring in the specific aspects and another dimension to be brought into this permanent exhibit. So thank you so much, Laurella. And of course, yes, we can look at the chat box at the end. And so now I will ask Luisa de Pina to speak, who will be doing her presentation in Spanish. And so she was an interior decorator and specialized in art history and specialized in management, economy, and financing of culture in the area of museums, and was had a training at university in museology and a diploma, a master's in museographics. And she is today director of museums, and she was in the on the board of directors. There's a huge list. I'm really very impressed, actually. And she was on the executive board. She's a member of the ICOM and on the scientific committee, and member of the LEAC, also a corresponding member of the ICOM memo, and vice president of the Dominican Republic in ICOM. And she also a founder with all of her diplomas, and also the permanent committee and the Memorial Museum of Resistance, and also on how to work together on building the so that museums still control the historic narrative, and these problems find their resonance, that's very strong resonance in Latin America. For example, there are different museum types, of memorial types of museums, and they work with the various communities. And so the museal culture in Latin America is different from that in Europe. And on this continent, the museums are maybe not as powerful and less powerful than European museums, but they do have the advantage of impact when they are associated with their communities, those. And so now I would like to ask Luisa de Pena Diaz, and for those who would like the translation, you do have translation possibilities. Yes, thank you. Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank ICOM France for having invited me to this permanent committee, the ethics committee of the ICOM. It's very interesting indeed, and it's a very important time as well in the process of ecomuseums within the ICOM. The ethics committee of ICOM intends to comply and to have the code of ethics complied with, and to give advice and submit changes to the committee. And I wanted to start this discussion with two questions, which we should try to answer internally. Do we keep heritage, and answer internally to the human factor, because the human factor is very important, and we must go to the next slide. I'm going to quite quickly. We're going to go on to the question of the participation of the community, and having the community participate. It doesn't go against the professional ethics. And on this topic, and how the community is integrated with the process of knowledge and creating knowledge, and actually the community, how it actually appropriates its own knowledge. And of course, we mustn't compromise a dialogue with the museum. And but we should be open and inclusive. And this doesn't mean um, abandoning museal freedom, actually. And of course, a lot of the members drew our attention to the drafting and the principles of rules. Up until what point can the community actually touch upon certain aspects of the museum internally? For example, the building, knowledge building within the memorial museums, for example. And the Memorial Museum, Dominican memory, for example, memorials. We had one year an event that was supposed to be held in the country, and there were changes, and there were very important changes that came up in the government and society, and there was a very aggressive campaign, and all means of communication were used, and so the children started questioning and asking. They didn't understand the process, and why at home and amongst friends at school, those who were their friends, they weren't friends anymore because they were affiliated to different parties. And so in this museum, there were volunteer workers who were people who worked together, and they went to neighbors that were close to the museums, and the museums opened up to these neighborhood meetings, and they had regular meetings held in the museum. And so there was direct contact with the close communities and the outreach programs. And so the museums organized with them, with these volunteer workers, and we called them children's elections. And so there were all of these various approaches. They had children there all the time, and it had such a strong impact that international senators came to observe this process. And so they came to the museum to see what we were doing with these children. And so the judges who organized these, and they were participating with their children, their grandchildren, and they came from also different regions from throughout the country. And just to end with this example, I would like to talk to you about an elderly gentleman that I met, and he came from a small village near the town. I was really surprised. And they said, my granddaughter is asking a lot of questions on the elections every day. I don't know what to say. And when I saw that, I said, well, I must go and see if he can solve my problem. And so this type of participation may seem not exactly well adapted, but yes, it is. It's training and learning civic action, and you don't learn that at school. They don't know what elections are and voting is. And so when we talk about transmitting knowledge, we did a workshop that we called to children, let me tell you. And so the children under the dictatorship spoke of their experiences from another point of view. The point of view of the victim is always something that we mention. And we often forget the collateral victims. They're usually families and children of families that have lost members of their families. And so we had witness accounts that we worked with, and they served to open a series of surveys and studies that the museum did regarding this practice of dictatorship that we hadn't talked about before. The next slide, please. And the last example before we go to the ethics part. This is an exhibit that was organized in Buenos Aires in Argentina at the ESMA Center, which is the school that was for the actually used as a torture center under the Argentinian dictatorship. And so this was an exhibit for the children that had disappeared. And so we had a picture of the mother and the father who had disappeared. And then there was a mirror where the visitor saw himself or herself next to the parents who had disappeared. And there were hundreds of photos and hundreds of mirrors. And this was a way to have the community become humanized, to humanize the community. And so for these people who have disappeared, we were materializing the loss of their children and their identities. And so the children looked for children that had disappeared. And here we had a lot of requests for searching for these through DNA, and we tried to find all of these children. There are still enormous amounts of children that are missing. And so when they went missing, when we try to look for them, it's really something extraordinary. And so this is something that a museum can do. Museums have responsibilities that involve learning about rights and educating on rights. And so you can promote values and diversity and the respect of human dignity. And with the new definition of museums, we had placed this very evidently in the forefront. And this was a part of the mission visibly of the museum, of course, and of the permanent, the Standing Committee on Ethics. And so when I revised the Code of Ethics, when I worked on that review, it wasn't just, just the drafting with some more friendly terms in this Code of Ethics, but also including new principles that is not just the social responsibility of museums, but also how should we face up to the ethics and the members, for example, and behavior and conduct. And we opened a consultation recently that's always open, and there'll be a third one by 2024. And we should come to an acceptable proposal, not only regarding drafting the present principles, but also the principles of that the community feels would be important to add. And so in 2025 in the General Council, we will be presenting it at the General Assembly, and with the new challenges as well, and the new terms being used. And one of the challenges would be to see how the community and the participation of the community in museum work can go against the involvement of curators, and that it doesn't go against the curator's work. And so we want to uphold this, and we want to maintain our stance as an educational and a scientific institution. And so we would want to be guarantors of good practices within the museum. I think I did a good concise work of all of this. And so now I am very present here for questions, and I would love to hear any questions you may have. Thank you. Thank you very much, Louisa. Sincerely, that's wonderful. I would like to hear the conclusion of Céline, who is in charge of the curators, and maybe we'll listen to her first, and then we can talk afterwards, because we've still got a few minutes left to have the interpreters with us, and then we're going to have to carry on without the interpreters. So it's all yours, Séverine. Can you hear me? Okay, very good, because I have my microphone and so I cannot hear myself, but so much as you want to. And so maybe with this, I try to conclude on this particularly dense evening. I would like to say how pleased I was to be with you this evening, and how with great interest that I followed all of these presentations and all of the partnering that we've been doing for the past several years with the ICOM, of organizing these discussion evenings of discussion. And also very pleased to be able to end our discussions. And of course, I measure all of our responsibilities of this task. Of course, since I myself come from archives, I'm not curator of museum, and so I do have a specialty in heritage, and I think that this opening up to other specialities is very good in terms of participatory practices. Also, there are other professional areas and practices that I've heard about this evening with great interest, and how they all participate in the various museums. Last year, we recalled in the introduction that the museum is an institution that serves the public and is open to the public, and it should be intuitive. And this new definition really should be advanced and broadened as well, to include factions of society, and broadening the practices, as was said in the presentation, new practices and participatory practices, and opening up to new forms of democratization or democracy. Also restoring these new horizons. And these were all at the heart of the questions that you had raised based on all of the presentations that were given. This was very relevant to me because, as a professional of heritage, that's one speciality, but there's another one that's, the collaborative aspect that was set up, in archives as of 2010, and which enabled research of the huge collection of archives. And from 2010 to 2014, we did that on World Museum Day, and a lot of the public were able to get knowledge of that, actually. And then also there was paleography that was being taught at the museums, and we can go back even further when we have the academics work with museums as well. And so as a head of the studies and of the curator department, there is adult education of professionals in the broader sense of heritage, and there is science and research publications as well, and how to include them in our training courses. And Emilie Girard spoke about this clearly in her introduction, how to train museum professionals. And sometimes it's very difficult to do so. And also, Sitzia. And this is a thought process that we had started, and how to open a training catalog on these new questions regarding these new areas of heritage.
We need to seek a response to this, and we have been working to do this. The issue has already been presented to you. I'm going to try to advertise that once more. This here's from professionals, researchers, institutions who have opened their doors to communities. It talks about the progress they've made, the results, but also questions that are still remaining. Work from Florent Molle and Julien talk about new fields of research opening up, about the types of collaborative research, the levels of success, about the ways of success and the remuneration practices. Xavier de la Selle talked about experimental approaches, which also places us within a research dynamic. In the issue of the heritage publication I showed, we can see how important heritage is, where it is demanded and subject to all kinds of claims more than previously. We have seen museums as a place where debates are held, whether conflictual or not, and I would like to bring together a few key points from various speakers. And I think that this will help us make progress in our reflection without necessarily answering all of our questions. The first point mentioned this evening was the question about who is participating and what type of participation is at work in museums. There are a number of major questions. We heard Emilie Sitzia talk about remuneration, forms of representation, the priorities that can be given. And the question about making debate or disagreement constructive as this may arise. We heard a number of different examples in the second half of the evening. Annabelle Ténèze presented an example about a participatory exhibition. With this participation, which is also creative and contributes to the work of the artist. The second aspect that I would like to talk about is institutions working with these types of participation. We heard about different types of museums from Lina Tahan. There are museums where participation is in their DNA. And this is in the case, the case for this project where participation is a raison d'être. This is true for the ecomuseums, the memorial museums that we saw presented by Laurella Rinçon with the MACte, or what Louisa de Pina just presented. Annabelle Ténèze also mentioned the possibility of taking the co-construction spaces outside of the museums themselves through partners that museums can contact, such as retirement homes, airports, schools, or even shops. The second type of institution, which was not mentioned this evening, are museums that want to control discourse. But this evening, we did not talk about this. Perhaps it would be worth continuing discussion on more complicated grounds about these refractory institutions with regard to participation. The third point was the role of different participations. So Xavier de la Selle was talking about this and involvement and how far we can go in sharing knowledge and skills. That Xavier de la Selle started by asking the question of the example of popular education with the question of participatory collections. Who can determine what must, what should, what shouldn't be collected, what can become heritage, and what deserves to be integrated into the collections? And finally, another issue was that of how to welcome the participants. This question was also raised in the report published. And finally, professionals need to continue and pursue research, and how can we ensure the continuity of these practices within museums? Finally, the final point was about pitfalls and obstacles. This responds to the question that we heard at the start: how can we avoid censure? Xavier de la Selle talked about the undermining of the legitimacy of institutions in very sensitive or conflictual topics. The example of the MACte shows how the institution has had to work alongside claims in order to echo some of the concerns, in order to move past them, in order to create the conditions for local populations to take ownership of the space. I would like to thank all of the speakers this evening who helped to explore these different fields, who asked questions, feeding in different experiences as well. So we have heard from Emilie Sitzia, Xavier de la Selle, Lina Tahan, Annabelle Ténèze, Laurella Rinçon, who has been working with the MACte and asking new questions. Louisa de Pina. I would like to thank everybody who helped get this panel together and to present different options and different perspectives. Thank you to all of the administrative team for organizing this event, which should have been held in a hybrid way with some people present in the auditorium. And I would also like to thank the interpreters who are having to work overtime at the moment, but this helps our foreign colleagues to speak and listen to this evening. Before finishing, I would like to go back to Pierre de Coubertin's citation. I would like to add to this and to say that the most important thing is not to win, it is to take part. And I do not wish that you remain in a state of combat, but I think that we can find true satisfaction within this, because participatory approaches have a lot of pleasure inherent within them, the pleasure of working together to find unexpected results satisfaction of launching new dynamics and moving beyond. I think that this is essential in order to overcome the obstacles and the pitfalls. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Séverine. Thank you for concluding this evening. It's been very rich. I would like to hand over to Emilie now. We do have a few questions on the chat. If you do have any others, then please do send them. I'm going to let you continue now. I have a very difficult role of choosing one or two questions before concluding. Thank you very much to the 91 people who are still online late into the evening with us. I have a question, Annabelle, for you about the district museum. Could you tell us how the collaboration with shopkeepers worked? We would love to hear more about that. I think that somebody else will be able to add to this because Manuel Aymon, who was working with the Abattoir team, is here this evening with us. The district museum was based on an initiative of people who knew what we do at the Abattoir, and work is carried out by this team, Emmanuel's team, for dialogue with different individuals. In each of our projects, we have mediation sheets, but then the partners themselves are the project mediators. If the people from the museum are not there to do mediation, the shopkeepers themselves, the team know their public, and there's a very strong bond built in this way. Emmanuel, I don't know if you would like to add anything to what I've just said with your direct experience with these participants. I know that you have worked with them. Good evening, everybody. This is following COVID because we heard that museums were not essential locations, they were closed, whereas shops were considered essential. So it was citizens in the local district. It was a former teacher who had retired. He used to work in a vocational high school. He encouraged shopkeepers to exhibit some of the artwork from the abattoir. This is a discussion each time. What are we trying to tell? You could imagine that the cheesemonger was not going to put artwork. We were able to print objects and place them in the shop window. There was there were meetings. We showed artwork. We don't annex these locations. We don't decide where we're going to place the artwork. We talk about what is possible. We have the same kinds of constraints. The aim is always to ensure the security and the integrity of the artwork. That's very important. So we talk about this, we try to plan ahead. There was a guide created for shopkeepers by the shopkeepers themselves. Public, the visitors, the buyers worked. This is a Quartier de la Colombette. It's a very open district in Toulouse. It's not necessarily transposable. This is a community of shopkeepers and citizens. During COVID, who wanted to see art, who wanted to catch their breath a little bit, and that's where it happened. Thank you very much for what you've said about these really interesting projects. I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to conclude now because we've overrun. I would just like to thank you for your participation. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you once again to the INP. Thank you to Marie-Laure for moderating today. And we will see you again in June. We will let you know the date of our next ethics debate evening very soon. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.